Just sit up, bring your shoulders back and just let them relax back a little bit. And just very, very, very gently raise your sternum, which is the bone between your rib cage. Don't, like, you know, just a tiny bit. What happens when you change your posture like that is your whole biochemistry shifts in your body. Your cortisol goes down, your oxytocin and testosterone goes up, you feel stronger, more present, more expansive, just by that tiny little shift, tiny little shift. It's a great tool to just notice. So when you're going back to paying attention to attention, part of the things that you can be paying attention to attention, not just externally, but what's your physiology? Because your physiology is, you know, remember we go back to that spiral of becoming. We've got the spiral of becoming where you perceive, you make emotion or meaning from that, and that it affects your physiology. But if you change your physiology, it goes back and changes your perception again. It's a constant feedback loop. So don't forget the importance of just always checking your body and always checking your body position, and just little shifts. Little shifts go a long way. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk a little bit about, so again, all semester long we've been talking about the whole mind-body connection, the whole spiral of becoming. Every moment of every day you're becoming something, you're transforming to something. You are constantly transforming. Whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, you're constantly transforming. Every moment, every day. What are you transforming to? You're transforming to the physiological imprint that you have of every moment. I could measure every single one of you right now, and you'd have a really distinct physiological imprint. We've been talking about that all semester long. The other thing that we've been talking a lot about is how it happens when you're in your fear response drive. Because remember, I told you, you got two drives. You got a drive to be calm, connected, coherent. When you're in that drive, you see expansiveness, you see possibility. You have the hormones that have to do with being able to see expansiveness and possibility. And then at the same time, you also have your fear response drive. Your fear response drive is made to make you see restriction. If you were, you know, back in evolutionary days, if you immediately had to do something, respond some way to keep yourself safe, you had to only see that thing. You had to only see the threat. So you are wired to only see threat when you feel threat. That's kind of important to know when we start going forward with all of this stuff, because now what we're responding to are our stresses that are unrelenting. They're not occasionally life-threatening with a mammoth following us, right? Now it's all day long, every day, in our perception. Every time we open our email, every time we get, you know, a text that we didn't want to get, every time we think about needing to go do our homework, every time we think about needing to go talk to a professor, every time you think about needing to pay a bill, every time you feel a little lonely, every time you feel social anxiety, every time you feel you're being judged, all of that is coming up with that same fear response. You're coming up with that same restriction. That's all you can see, because that's the way your fear response is wired. And it's a good wiring. When it's really keeping you safe, it's a good wiring. If you're walking down a dark alley at night that you shouldn't be walking down and somebody starts following you, it's a good thing that you're only seeing that and you know how to respond. But that's not usually what we're dealing with all day long. What we're usually dealing with is the opposite. What we're usually dealing with is all day long, where we're perceiving and perceiving and perceiving of all of these things. And again, because of our restriction of our fear response, that's all we see. So again, two systems. You get better at the system you're most often in. We've been talking all semester long about that. I'm just trying to pull this all together because we're about to shift a little bit, because what we've been doing is learning about how that all works, learning about all the systems that go together in that, our biochemical system, our neural system, how your neural nets just fire to more of the same, how your neural nets fire to original experience, are the electrical patterns of your heart, how they reflect your emotional experience, and then go right back to the deepest parts of your brain to just cultivate more of the same. It's a constant feedback loop. So, and so then we started to talk about, so now what do you do about it? And so we talked about paying attention to attention. Just where is your attention? Just noticing where your attention is, because most of the time we don't even realize where it is. Again, 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day. It's a lot of thoughts. Most of the time you're not even aware of those thoughts. 85% of those repetitive, same thoughts over and over and over and over. And again, you're molding to those thoughts. 85% of them negative. And you're just molding to what the emotional context of those thoughts are. So again, most of the time we don't even know. So paying attention to attention was big. Just paying attention to where your attention is. Because most of the time we're on automatic pilot. We don't even realize that we're obsessing about all the things that could go wrong, will go wrong. We're certainly going to go wrong. We're keeping them in our head, everything that happened wrong in the morning that's going to happen wrong in the afternoon. We're not even aware of it. So paying attention to attention was huge. And then I taught you a couple, and now I'm adding again to the paying attention to attention of just paying attention to where your physiology is. I mean, at first we were just looking at where your thoughts are, where your inner chatter is, because again, we all have that inner chatter. We all have it. So paying attention to what it's telling you all day long is a pretty powerful tool. But also now we're adding to that paying attention to attention, what's your physiology like? Just notice where your shoulders are. Your shoulders are always going to be reflecting your emotional state. And most of the time we're holding them up, tight, and forward, and we don't even realize it. And there's been some amazing studies that show how your whole biochemistry shifts just by relaxing your shoulders and lifting your chest just a little bit. Simple tools. So paying attention to attention. We talked about the power of pause. How you can just pause in a moment and break that reactivity. We talked about present moment awareness, which is a little different. The power of pause was just kind of taking a breath. So while the power of pause is just pausing in that moment of reactivity, taking a breath, calming your body down, present moment awareness is really when you bring your awareness externally. So the power of pause, you're kind of bringing your awareness internal to your own processes, your own reactivity, taking a breath, calming yourself down. Present moment awareness is actually when you ground yourself and really bring yourself present, and most often includes kind of noticing what's right around you, noticing the sounds, noticing the sights, and just really bringing yourself right here, right now, and focusing on all your senses as they're experiencing that very now moment. They're very connected, but they are different as well. Again, power of pause is kind of internally focused. Present moment awareness is externally focused. Attitude breathing was, again, when we have some specific attitude, we're getting ready to take a test, or we're getting ready to take or give a presentation or something like that, and you're feeling nervous. Attitude breathing is the intention to breathe an emotion that would be more supportive of you in that specific moment, in that specific situation. So it's not just about calming yourself down, it's about really intentionally trying to cultivate a different emotional state just by breathing the felt experience of that emotion. And again, by breathing the felt experience of that emotion, it begins to switch your whole physiology so you can experience that emotion. So if you remember the story that I told at the Stress and Resilience lecture, the story about that crazy stressed out morning where all I could do was focus on my stress,
but had a moment where I was able to really, really bring myself present and pause, calm myself down, and then run into my dad and have a nice connection with my dad, and which ultimately ended up to be the last time I ever saw him, although I didn't know that at the time. He died a few hours later. If you remember that story, those were the two tools I did. I did the power of pause to calm myself down, and then I did present moment awareness to really ground myself in what was going on right there, right now. And I had a complete shift in my emotional state. And then it was then that I ran into my dad, and it was then that I was able to be fully present and connected with him. So again, let's just briefly recap the ways that we've talked about how to first reduce your fear response system, and then second, actively cultivate your calm and connection system. So we are changing our capacities for resilience. We do that in everyday ways of being, and which we've talked about in the 3-to-1 ratio, micro moments, attention to attention, cementing moments of joy. Those are just things that you can do in your everyday way of being. And then we've talked about ways to stop your stress response once it's been activated. And again, what those tools that I've given you so far are the power of pause, present moment awareness, and attitude breathing. Because you need to calm your stress response or your fear response system before you can actively cultivate your calm and connection system. Okay, so it's a two-tiered process. You need to calm your fear response system, but then if you really want to not being sick or not being stressed doesn't necessarily mean that you're really cultivating the capacity that's going to really lead you to higher states of well-being or higher states of resilience. So it's about reducing your fear response system, absolutely. But then the second piece of that is then how do we begin to actively cultivate our calm and connection system?
Yourself in the moment, stopping that reactivity. And what stopping that reactivity and pausing in the moment does is make you available for another shift. And the other shift is what begins to really cultivate your other system, your calm and connection system. Because your calm and connection system has to be exercised. Again, this is just like exercise. The more you do anything, the better you get at it. But your calm and connection system, the neurons in your calm and connection system are slower, and there's not as many of them. It's not because they're less important, but back in evolutionary time, we had to be able to react quickly from danger way faster than we had to create community and love and bond and connect. Both were important. We wouldn't have survived as a species without either of those. So both drives are important, but your calm and connection system, because the neurons are slower, because there's less of them, it takes more intentionality to cultivate that. Because the system that you're in most often is the system that begins to dominate your life, just through all the physiological reasons that we talked about. I mean, we've been talking all semester long about the way that the science behind why that's true. And one of the reasons I hit the science so hard is because it is pretty indisputable science. It's not just about, oh yeah, feel good and your life will go good. So now what we're doing is we're going to take a shift, and that shift is how do you begin to intentionally cultivate your calm and connection system? So we've talked about kind of changing again, and what we're doing is we're changing our capacities, right? So your capacity is your ability to do something. So by being in your calm and connection system more often, you're actually changing your capacity to live from that system. And again, I think when we were doing something a couple weeks ago and somebody says, oh, I was talking about the 3-to-1 ratio and the top and the bottom of the chart, and somebody put up on there, sometimes I just want to be sad. Absolutely. This isn't about forcing yourself to be happy all the time, not remotely. But what it is about is exercising some self-care and understanding that the more often you are in any emotional state, the better you get at that emotional state. So is it totally normal and healthy to be sad sometimes? Absolutely. But if that's all you're ever doing, and again, there's no judgment on it, it's just the fact is that if that's all you're ever doing, you're just going to get better at doing that. Okay, again, there's no judgment on that at all. It's just that you get better at what you do most often. The ratio is so important. It doesn't expect you to be perfect all the time, number one, and it doesn't expect you to even want to be perfect all the time. Sometimes we're sad, and that's okay. And sometimes we're a little angry, and that's okay. The idea is just discerning for yourself, and I'm not here to tell you what's right and what's wrong. The idea is discerning for yourself. Once you have enough background to really understand it, discerning for yourself, what is that level for you? Because if you want to be sad all the time, but then you're just increasingly getting more and more and more sad and more and more and more sad, and then pretty soon you're living what you feel like is a hopeless life, that might be something to listen to. Okay, so again, this isn't about being perfect. It's not about you don't, not remotely, because pretending doesn't work. It's your authentic experience. So we've talked about a couple different things. We've talked about everyday ways of being. In other words, just things that shifts that you can make all day long, every day. We've talked about how to stop your stress response. And then we're going to talk about how to actively cultivate something else. So everyday ways of being, we talked about the 3-to-1 ratio. Again, what was the 3-to-1 ratio? If you have your emotional chart that I just asked you to get out, just look at that. The 3-to-1 ratio, or try to remember back, the 3-to-1 ratio is if you can be up at the top of that chart more often than at the bottom of the chart, huge changes begin to shift. And again, that's what's so beautiful about the 3-to-1 ratio is it doesn't expect you to be perfect all the time. And there is no perfect. It's not human nature to just be happy all the time. But the 3-to-1 ratio reminds us that when we can shift, it might be a good idea in exercising self-care to do that. Because again, sometimes it's just as easy to think about all the things that are going wrong as all the things that are good. And you know what? Most of the time, both stories are true, honestly. But if the story that you focus on becomes the story that you begin to live, it might be a good thing to just look at the stories that you're focusing on. And again, there's no right and wrong about this. This is all about just kind of exercising some self-care about how you want to be in the world. Okay, we also talked about micro moments. Those are moments that you can create. Those are moments you create yourself, right? They wouldn't necessarily happen, but just stopping to have a meaningful conversation with somebody. Stopping, again, I'm a dog person, stopping to pet a dog, stopping to look at the flowers, stopping to just, oh my gosh, Mount Baldy's really beautiful this morning. Right? Creating micro moments, because those micro moments create a completely different physiological imprint. And it just has to be for a few moments. Those all day long, the more those imprints become who you are in the dominant way that you're being. Again, it's just like exercise. Micro moment is like going out and running a mile for exercise. You're just training your mind-body complex to be in that state more often. We talked about attention to attention, and we talked about cementing moments of joy. How do you begin to, just pause? Most of the time we go through and we don't even realize all the good things are happening to us. And so just to pause and recognize when something was really good happening, and it's like you're trying to make a cellular memory of it, because you really are. And by making that cellular memory of it, then it becomes more of your typical way of being. Okay, so then we talked about tools to stop your stress response. The power of pause I just talked about, and that had, for me, it was a life-changing moment. And I had no idea. I thought it was a terrible morning I was going to school. But just to be able to stop and remember to do the power of pause, because it takes remembering in those moments. For me, just remembering that tool at the right time gave me one of the most important moments of my life. And the same thing with present moment awareness. Okay, so those are tools that you begin to stop your stress response. Attitude breathing, or I call it heartful breathing in the book, is when you purposely now begin to breathe a different attitude. What does that mean? That means if you're feeling, you say you're going in to do a presentation, or you have to go in to talk to a professor, or you are having a difficult conversation with a loved one, or you're going in to take a test and you're really nervous about the test. Everything about your biochemistry is reflecting how you're feeling. So if you can begin to shift your feeling, it's almost like you're breathing the opposite attitude. If you breathe calm, you're going to create the biochemistry shift of calm, and then it's going to go back and change your perception. This is jumping out in at the level of your physiology to reverse that spiral. If you're breathing understanding, if you're breathing non-reactivity, you're in a difficult conversation with somebody and you don't want to get into a reactive place, just breathing calmness, breathing understanding, because what happens is those little shifts change your physiological imprint, which goes back and then changes your perception. Okay, so now the next thing that we do is we actively cultivate something different. So that morning with my dad, I paused, but then when I saw him, I was able to actively cultivate a connection with him. I still could have walked by and say, "Hey Dad, it's good to see you, but I'm late," right? So then the second piece now is we want to intentionally and actively begin to cultivate our calm and connection system, which is very different than just calming our stress response. Does that make sense? We have these two different systems. Calming one doesn't necessarily create the other. When I talked about positive psychology, I said not being sick doesn't necessarily mean being well. Right? So just calming your stress response doesn't mean that you're actively creating something else. Imagine this. You're going in to take a test, and it's a test that you're nervous about. Or you're going in to talk to a professor, and that professor makes you feel really insecure. Or you need to go talk to your parents about something, and you know it's just going to end up in a fight or something like that. So you do the power of pause, you calm yourself down, you feel a little better, you do present moment awareness, okay, I'm ready, and all of a sudden those feelings come back. Oh my gosh, I'm not going to do good on my test, or that professor's just going to knock me down, or I know it's going to, and so you calm yourself down and you calm yourself down, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, gosh, no, and then they calm yourself down, but those feelings come back. It's like, okay, so what are you going to think about if I say don't think about the yellow kangaroo? All right, what do you think about? Thank you. Somebody act like you're awake at least. Okay, so what are you thinking about? The yellow kangaroo. Stopping your fear response, if all your focus is on your fear response, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to shift your awareness to something else. So shifting your awareness to something else is the next step. Sometimes calming is just enough. But sometimes it absolutely requires making the next shift. Because if you're in a really, really agitated space or a place where your fear response is really kicked in, two things are true. You can't just automatically shift. You got to calm first. But after you calm, you need to intentionally shift, or it's just going to keep coming back. Right? So it's a two-step process of calming your fear response, but then actively and intentionally engaging in a different response, right? In a different response. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about something that I call HEART, which is Heartful Emotion Affect Regulation Training. So what is affect regulation? Affect. Affect means the emotional state that you bring to any moment. So if somebody came walking in here and their shoulders were down and they were looking down, I'd say, wow, they have a really sad affect. Or if somebody came in and was standing up tall and shoulders back, sternum up, walking in, and wow, they've got a really positive affect. So affect just means you're presenting emotional state. Affect regulation means your ability to be able to regulate that state. And we all have that ability to a certain extent, but again, that's one of those things that can be trained. You can train your affect regulation, meaning that you can change how you bring your emotional state to every moment. And it's not about pretending. Your body and your brain, your whole body-mind complex reflects your authentic experience. It's what you're really feeling. So I don't care how much you're trying to talk yourself out of it. It's not, emotion comes from a different place in your brain where you try to think from. That's why I always say positive thinking doesn't work. It doesn't work unless you believe it. Now, if you believe it and it's your authentic experience, that's something else. So the idea is, how do we begin to shift our authentic experience to something else? And the more often we can intentionally do that, the more often we change our affect, in other words, our presenting emotional state, and the greater our affect regulation is. And I'll tell you, there's probably not any bigger attribute that you can develop that's going to make you successful in life than the ability to regulate your affect. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care how successful you are. It's not going to last if you don't have the ability to regulate your affect to what's appropriate in certain circumstances. And so your affect regulation can be trained. And your affect regulation to be remaining in your calm and connection system can be trained. And again, what happens when you're in your calm and connection system? It shows that we actually see more expansiveness. They've done a huge amount of research on this. When you are in a calm and grounded state, you see possibility instead of restriction. You see expansiveness instead of restriction. Talking about qualities that are going to make you successful in life, those are them. We also have what's called the broaden and build theory. In other words, that the more you are in your calm and connection system, the more you are able to see more possibility, but then you begin to build that possibility because you act on it. So everything, from a neuroscientific view, everything begins to shift the more often that you can actively and intentionally engage your calm and connection system. And that's what HEART is. We're going to go into a bunch of tools that I call the HEART tools. And what it is heartful emotion affect regulation training. So you're going to learn to train your affect, or train your ability for what your presenting emotion is by training. Again, we get better at what we do. You can train your affect. You can train your ability to what your presenting emotional state is.